there is a newly created tournament called Megalobox. This tournament is a combination of boxing and modern technology. It is organized by a large corporation and promises to surpass all countries and organizations, allowing anyone to rise up with the desire to claim the title of the strongest fighter. The scale will be worldwide, and the final match will take place in 3 months to find the true champion. The media considers this tournament just a violent TV show, but the large corporation views it as a community program. At the same time, we know that fighters participating in the tournament will be equipped with a support device called gear. Our main character, Joe, is currently watching information about the Megalobox tournament while getting his motorcycle repaired. The repair shop owner doesn't know what Joe did to damage the bike so badly, and he also advised Joe to register and participate in that boxing tournament. However, Joe couldn't participate even if he wanted to because he is not a legal citizen of this country. People living outside the city like Joe are called free citizens, so they are not controlled by any government but also don't have citizenship rights. It's like being both at the top and bottom of society at the same time. Joe's current job is working as a boxer in an underground arena for gangsters to gamble on, which is not recommended in any form. As Joe arrived at his workplace, his alcoholic trainer named Nanbu came to borrow some money because he had just lost a bet. Joe often has to fight matches that have been rigged in advance by the organizers to scam viewers betting money. Joe now feels very frustrated because he always has to pretend to lose in the ring despite his high talent. However, as an illegal citizen like Joe, he can only accept it because this is the only job he can do to make money. Before entering the ring, Joe was given an earpiece to listen to Nanbu's instructions, and he was also equipped with a gear to support his fighting, similar to the Megalobox tournament. However, the audience and Joe's opponent were very surprised because his gear was extremely shabby. As soon as he got on the stage and heard the signal to start the match, Joe's opponent rushed to attack him repeatedly. With his modern gear, everyone could see that he had an equipment advantage. But Joe gently pushed his arm aside and started to counterattack. However, before he could knock him out completely, the bell signaling the end of the round suddenly rang. After witnessing Joe's performance, many people chose to trust and bet on him. Joe told Nanbu that if he fought seriously, the opponent would definitely be knocked out in one punch. But in the second round, Joe had to pretend to lose so that the organizers could win all the bets placed on him. The lesson learned here is what? The house always wins, so stop gambling and be a good person. After this recent job, Nanbu also earned some money to pay off debts, but Joe was no longer interested in this unethical work, so he took his newly repaired motorcycle out for a ride. Meanwhile, the female chairwoman of that corporation, Yuki, was monitoring the construction process of the stadium for the Megalobox tournament. Accompanying Yuki was a silver-haired fighter under her command named Yuri. Right after that, while Yuki was crossing the road, she was almost hit by Joe driving by, but Joe managed to swerve to avoid her and crashed into the sidewalk. Thanks to that, Yuki wasn't harmed. Seeing Yuki approach to apologize, Joe scolded her for crossing the road without looking. Yuki gave Joe her business card and told him to call her if he needed compensation. But when Joe realized she was the organizer of the Megalobox tournament, he didn't want it and brushed off the business card. As Yuki was about to leave, Joe suddenly said that her tournament was just trash, so Yuri quickly stepped up to challenge Joe to a fight to defend his mistress. But before they could fight, Yuki told Yuri to return with her. The next morning, Joe returned to the underground arena to fight the arranged matches as usual. Joe and Nanbu stood waiting for a long time but still didn't see their opponent appear. However, Yuri suddenly stepped onto the arena with a modern gear integrated into his body. As soon as they saw Yuri, everyone was very surprised because he was the champion of the Megalobox tournament. Yuri said he came here to settle the dispute from last night with Joe. Nanbu tried to stop the fight because he thought Joe couldn't beat Yuri, but Joe angrily punched Nanbu and happily accepted Yuri's challenge. Everyone was excited to buy tickets and bet on Yuri in this match. As soon as the fight began, Joe rushed to attack Yuri but couldn't land a hit. Even Yuri's light punch caused a slight scratch on Joe's face. Then Yuri said he would defeat Joe with just one hand, and indeed he beat Joe badly using only his left hand. When Nanbu saw Joe being knocked down by Yuri, he advised Joe to stay down if he didn't want to get hurt more. But Joe stubbornly stood up and continued the unfinished fight. However, this time Joe successfully dodged Yuri's left-hand attack and landed a punch on Yuri's face, forcing him to use his right hand to block. Yuri now truly acknowledged Joe's ability, so he decided to fight with both hands to show Joe what a Megalobox fighter is really like. Right after that, Joe rushed to attack Yuri, but was immediately struck by a powerful punch from Yuri, which caused Joe to fall to the ground and gradually lose consciousness. The referee declared Yuri the winner when he saw that Joe was completely knocked out and couldn't get up anymore. However, as Yuri was about to leave the underground arena, Joe suddenly stood up and demanded to continue fighting. But Yuri refused because he didn't want to fight a weakling like Joe, and Yuri said that if Joe wanted to fight again, he would have to participate in the Megalobox tournament and meet him in the finals. Joe then took his motorcycle out for a ride after being humiliatingly defeated by Yuri. He decided that he would participate in the tournament to have a rematch with Yuri. At the same time, Yuki discovered that Yuri had gone to the underground arena to fight with Joe. She reminded Yuri that he was not allowed to go to the underground arena like that again. As soon as he returned to the underground arena, Joe asked Nanbu to find a way to help him participate in the tournament. But Nanbu thought it was impossible because Joe was not a legal citizen here, not to mention that only the 4 strongest fighters were allowed to participate in the Megalobox tournament. Nanbu advised Joe to give up that unrealistic thought and prepare for his upcoming fight. According to the organizers' arrangement, Joe was supposed to lose in the 5th round today. But Joe decided not to listen to Nanbu and knocked out his opponent with just one punch. Immediately after, Nanbu was taken to meet Fuji, the boss of this arena, to apologize for Joe not following the arrangement. He was forced to work for Fuji until he paid off the debt he had borrowed from him. That day, Nanbu was extremely afraid of him. He had to bow and apologize until he was injured, but Fuji still wanted to take his remaining eye as punishment. Seeing no other choice, Nanbu suddenly said that he would find a way to get Joe into the Megalobox tournament, and after Joe won that tournament, he would pay off all the debt to Fuji without missing a penny. Fuji also felt a bit interested when he saw Nanbu's determination, so he ordered someone to make a fake citizen ID for Joe to participate in that tournament. After receiving Joe's fake citizen ID, Nanbu went to register Joe for the Megalobox tournament. Joe is currently ranked lowest because this is his first time participating in an official tournament. Joe will temporarily live with Nanbu on a boat until the tournament takes place. Joe clearly understands that he must make it to the finals to have a chance to face Yuri. But Nanbu tells Joe not to worry about Yuri yet and to focus on defeating the opponents in front of him to climb the ranks first. Yuri's gear is the most advanced type created by the corporation, and that gear has been directly integrated into Yuri's body as a part of him. Meanwhile, a group of homeless children have planned to steal items from the market, and while the camera shop owner wasn't paying attention, they managed to steal several cameras from him. Joe and Nanbu went to a store to buy replacement parts for Joe's current gear, but Nanbu suddenly became excited when he saw a gear made from titanium alloy. The guard informed them that this was the first model produced by the Technology Corporation. Right after that, the children from earlier came to the store to sell the cameras they had just stolen, and the store owner gave them some candy as payment. However, a boy named Sashio was very angry because the owner had given them one piece of candy less than agreed. Seeing Sashio's defiance, the store owner pulled out a small knife to intimidate the boy, forcing Joe to quickly intervene to stop the store owner before things got worse. The kids quickly left, but Joe got cut on the nose by the owner. Joe and Nanbu returned to their boat under the bridge, and Nanbu had to train Joe hard because his first opponent was quite strong. While playing in the river with his friends, Sashio discovered that Joe was planning to enter the tournament, so Sashio asked Joe to take him along to the tournament. But Joe didn't want to bring a kid like Sashio, so the boy left angrily. The next morning, Sashio's friends came to tell Joe that the boy had been captured by the parts store owner because he had tried to steal the titanium alloy gear from him. The boy had told his friends to try to get that gear for Joe to wear in the tournament. Meanwhile, the store owner was having his guard torture Sashio to force the boy to return the gear, but Joe suddenly drove his motorcycle in and pinned the guard down with it. However, the guard was unharmed after the collision. Nanbu and the kids arrived just as Joe successfully rescued Sashio. Then Joe took off his outer jacket to reveal the titanium gear underneath, but it shattered into many pieces after just one hit from the guard. However, Joe decided he would defeat the guard barehanded. Joe ran straight at the guard and knocked him out to everyone's amazement. Joe had a different view of Sashio after this incident and decided to bring Sashio to the tournament as his assistant. A few days later, Joe went to the Megalar Box tournament arena to participate in his first qualifying match. His opponent was a seemingly strong fighter ranked 185th, but Joe fought him without using any gear or support tools. It turned out that the night before the match, Nanbu had suggested Joe fight without gear, because fighting barehanded would attract more attention from strong opponents and the media, and if this plan worked, he would be promoted faster to reach the tournament finals sooner. Back to the present, everyone was quite surprised that Joe wasn't using gear to compete. Joe's opponent thought he was looking down on him and the tournament, but the referee said there were no rules or regulations requiring contestants to have gear or support items. As soon as the match began, the opponent continuously attacked Joe, forcing him to focus on dodging. He counterattacked and repeatedly struck the opponent's face, but the lack of gear made his punches less powerful. Conversely, although the opponent had gear, his attack speed was quite slow, but if he landed a hit, Joe would certainly take a lot of damage. He only hit Joe once, and Joe immediately fell despite blocking the blow. Joe then stood up when the count reached only 5. Nanbu had to call him over for a huddle. Nanbu wanted him to make fewer mistakes like just now if he didn't want to end up in the qualifiers. He wanted Joe not to think about trading blows, but to move more to make the opponent lose balance. Both he and Sashio outside the ring were panicking and messing things up. When the fight resumed, Joe felt his steps were very heavy. Joe only continuously dodged, making the audience displeased. The opponent was quite frustrated at not being able to hit Joe, so when he finally caught Joe, he angrily threw him to the ground and punched him relentlessly. But he was warned by the referee because his throwing action was against the rules. Back to the fight, Joe still tried to dodge while Nanbu outside kept complaining and shouting at him. During the break, Nanbu and Joe had an argument. He complained about Joe not fighting properly, while Joe still wanted to fight his own way. Sashio spoke up, saying that Nanbu only cared about fame and profit like those watching the tournament, and he was now no different from a fake coach. Nanbu reflected and realized that Joe was feeling afraid of fighting without gear, so he told Joe to try to find a way to control his fear. After hearing the advice from him, Joe finally regained his composure. Right after that, Joe remembered what he had learned from Nanbu and moved more flexibly. The opponent tried to attack Joe but couldn't hit him at all. Joe could even easily throw a terribly strong punch that knocked him down. When seeing that the opponent was completely knocked out, the referee immediately declared Joe the winner, so the surrounding audience was very surprised and stood up to congratulate Joe. That afternoon, they happily returned home after Joe's first victory in Megalar Box. In the time that followed, Joe continuously defeated many other opponents to increase his ranking and reputation. He also quickly became famous for not using gear. However, with his current position, Joe certainly still couldn't make it to the tournament finals, so Nanbu asked a reporter to arrange for Joe to fight a high-ranking boxer. But Nanbu was very surprised to learn that the boxer who was about to fight Joe was his old student. We then learned that this man is Agaki. Nanbu never expected to meet Agaki here, and he was glad to have escaped the hell called war. Agaki was very grateful to Nanbu for helping him to return to boxing again in this tournament. He wanted to show gratitude to Nanbu, but Nanbu felt that him being alive and well was enough. He was surprised that Agaki was currently in the top 17 and still chose to fight Joe, who had just become famous. But that was the only favor he gave Nanbu, because he decided he would destroy Joe, destroy the fighter that Nanbu had invested so much time in, because he also wanted to reclaim from Nanbu the things he had lost. Nanbu then returned and told Joe that he wouldn't fight the next match. Joe angrily asked what not fighting meant, and Nanbu said not fighting means not fighting. Joe thought that fighting Agaki at a high rank would help him rank up more easily, and this was what they had aimed for from the beginning. But Nanbu thought the result would only be very bad. He didn't say Joe would definitely lose, but only implied that his upcoming fight would be extremely difficult, and his current ability was not enough. His opponent knew all of Nanbu's strategies and was also the best talent he had trained. But Sashio showed him that Agaki was no longer the same as before. After being brought back from the battlefield, he had lost his legs and was using prosthetic legs to walk. Nanbu couldn't believe Agaki could fight in this condition, but he also didn't want Joe to be overconfident because Agaki was still very strong. But Joe was still determined to defeat Agaki, so Nanbu decided to listen to him. After that, both of them went to train. Nanbu knew Joe's weakness was his arm strength. If he couldn't get close enough, Joe wouldn't be able to generate enough force to damage his opponent. He knew that now all his unusual tactics couldn't be applied, so the only way was to hone Joe's existing skills. The next day, Joe went out for a run, and when he returned, he asked Sashio where Nanbu was. Nanbu had gone out and was muttering something while cooking. Joe advised Sashio to exercise more instead of playing with machines too much, but the kid wasn't interested. Sashio had found more information about Agaki, that he was excellent and strong, but due to his age, he had been called for military service. When he returned, he was in this broken state. However, after returning to competition, it only took him a few months to climb back up to his current 17th rank. Most of his opponents were brutally devastated, so it seems his statement about destroying Joe wasn't a joke. Meanwhile, Nanbu went to find Agaki but only met his new coach. He led Nanbu to see the graves of soldiers who returned from the war. These people couldn't withstand the psychological shock from the battlefield, so after returning for a while, they all chose to end their own lives. Agaki had overcome those things and chose to return because he wanted to meet Nanbu again, yet Nanbu wasn't there. Nanbu thought Agaki had died, so the other coach thought Nanbu had given up too early just because of a death notice. Nanbu knew he was wrong and didn't ask for Agaki's forgiveness, but he only hoped Agaki wouldn't bring personal matters into the ring. The coach then went to meet Agaki and gave him some advice. He advised Agaki to give up this fight and try to aim for higher-ranked people, because a fight with a low-ranked person was meaningless. If Agaki persisted, he would look no different from a miserable person angry at being abandoned. He was jealous of Nanbu's new student, who had taken the position that should have been his. But Agaki thought he had his own circumstances that the coach couldn't understand. Agaki had previously also had thought, but it was Nanbu who had helped him abandon that idea. He had come to Nanbu's gym to find him, but the place had been closed and now disbanded. At this time, he had met Joe. When Nanbu returned, he heard that Joe had gone somewhere. Sashio had found information that Agaki's gear wasn't too heavy, so the power increase wouldn't be too much. But Nanbu knew he chose light gear to not affect his speed and bet that the new legs might even be faster than the old ones. Nanbu had only known Agaki was alive a few days ago. He had almost forgotten everything about Agaki, so he couldn't blame anyone for being hated. Meanwhile, Agaki told Joe that the old Nanbu would never show off by having his student fight without gear, but Joe still strongly believed in Nanbu. Agaki thought Joe would sooner or later be abandoned by Nanbu, but Joe knew Agaki was angry and blaming Nanbu for his condition. Joe said Agaki could blame whoever he wanted, but in the end, the decision would be his own. So if he intended to destroy Joe, he could try, but Joe said it wouldn't be easy. That evening during training, Nanbu always wanted Joe to learn how to counter Agaki. But Joe thought he wouldn't lose, so Nanbu shouldn't worry because he would fight his own way. After all this time, Agaki still couldn't forget the day he lost his legs, but Nanbu's image was what troubled him the most. The fight was about to begin. The number of spectators was overwhelming, and the arena couldn't hold all these people. At this time, Nanbu had come to find Agaki to admit his fault and ask him not to take out his anger on Joe. When they entered the ring, everyone cheered for both Agaki and Joe. Nanbu remembered the day he heard Agaki had died. He was very angry and lost his composure. The other coach now only believed that Agaki had to fight this match to have the spirit to rise up, so he let him fight. As soon as it started, Joe and Agaki exchanged a few light blows. Joe was knocked down and quickly got up again. And just as Joe missed a punch, Agaki quickly gave Joe a knockdown blow. Agaki seemed very serious about his desire to crush Nanbu's hope. Seeing Joe knocked down and not getting up until the count of 5, Nanbu started to worry. Agaki was determined to reclaim everything from Nanbu. Joe then stood up and continued to challenge Agaki. Joe repeatedly clung to Agaki to grapple, but the audience started to get bored and wanted both to fight properly. Sashio thought Nanbu must know some weakness of Agaki, but Nanbu realized Agaki was now different, using his prosthetic legs too well to both attack and counterattack when there was an opening. Joe was then thrown out and Agaki kept a good distance, preventing Joe from counterattacking. Just as Agaki found an opening and launched an attack, the bell ending the round saved Joe. Nanbu wanted Joe to give up here because he couldn't win. Ensuring a student leaves the ring safely is also a coach's duty. He could find another match for Joe to fight rather than risking injury here that might prevent him from fighting later. But Joe said his path was a one-way street. If Nanbu couldn't keep up and wanted to turn back, he should get off. Otherwise, he should just observe silently. Joe returned to the ring and decided to distribute his strength evenly between both hands. Hearing Nanbu's teachings from Joe's mouth, Agaki lost his composure and rushed to knock Joe down. But Joe continued to get up and tried to apply Nanbu's training. Thanks to the strategy of only defending to get close to Agaki, Joe made it through the second round. Agaki's coach wanted him to finish it in the next round. Agaki remembered the words Joe had just said were also what Nanbu had taught him to cover his weaknesses. Nanbu now told Joe that Agaki was gradually figuring him out and was now just wanting to torment him right in front of Nanbu. Joe admitted Nanbu was right, but that was only the beginning. Now Agaki had realized that beating Joe wasn't as easy as he thought, so both were now aiming for victory, and Joe couldn't easily withdraw. Back to the fight, Joe continued to provoke Agaki, so Agaki dominated more to torture Joe. Nanbu didn't understand what Agaki's ultimate goal was now. He knew he had made a mistake in pushing Joe into this fight, and at the same time, he was wrong in not trusting Joe, and now Joe was paying Agaki's debt for him. Joe was knocked out once again, but he still stood up and said Nanbu was wrong. He didn't care about what happened between them. He just saw Agaki as an obstacle he had to overcome. He then repeatedly said Nanbu's words, causing Agaki to lose his composure and miss his punches. Not missing the opening, Joe launched a knockout blow that dropped Agaki on the spot. The coach then called, and Agaki regained consciousness. They then returned to the defensive stance like in the second round, waiting for the opponent to make a mistake. But thanks to that last move, Nanbu had more determination that Joe would definitely win. Both sides now fought by evenly distributing force into both hands. Nanbu told Sashio the reason Joe had always been able to survive in the underground arena with just that crappy gear was because of his strong will that wasn't easily broken. Agaki increasingly exposed weaknesses and let Joe hit him. Agaki also soon lost balance and continuously took hits, but he had to fight back to retaliate. And the bell ending the round rang once again. Joe and Agaki were able to smile at each other. Agaki then spoke to his coach and immediately chose to forfeit and concede victory to Joe. Joe knew he had won but also collapsed from exhaustion. The reason Agaki gave up was because his prosthetic legs had started to become unstable. If he continued, he might not be able to walk anymore. Nanbu then came to meet his old student. He also realized Agaki was injured in the leg. Agaki had tried to close everything with him through defeating Joe. He had tried to find an answer, and now he had the answer he wanted. Joe had told him the right words, that his current state was due to his own decisions, and he had no right to resent anyone. After that, he asked Nanbu to give Joe something, which was Nanbu's old betting slip. Nanbu had intended to place a bet to earn money to treat Agaki to a meal before he enlisted, but because he lost, he ended up giving it to Agaki as a good luck charm. Indeed, it had saved his life by helping him abandon his suicidal thoughts. Agaki then asked him to pass on his good wishes to Joe. Not long after, the third person to secure a ticket to participate in the main Megalobox tournament was revealed. This person was 2 meters tall and had an extremely aggressive fighting style. When the press asked Yuki if there was any chance for Joe, she said she would only answer when his ranking continued to rise. Yuri only now learned that Joe was rapidly climbing the ranks out there. The fate of the two was not yet over, but Yuri's colleague believed that Joe would soon fall because this tournament was not for stray dogs. Since the previous match, Joe's fame had skyrocketed. Everyone was rushing to publish articles about him. Street art featuring Joe appeared everywhere. Now, Joe's fans were the father of all types of fans. Everyone on the street had to respect them. Wearing clothes with Joe's image was like wearing royal robes. Not long after, the match between the top 4 and top 7 took place. We only need to pay attention to this top 7 youth, Mikio. Everyone didn't know if Joe had a chance to squeeze into this match or not. But Nanbu didn't want to be envious, so he only went to watch and didn't let Joe fight. He accidentally met Yuki and suggested that if she didn't give Joe some opportunity to fight, many people would think she was favoring her brother Mikio. Of course, she would give Joe a chance to shine if he wasn't injured after the fight with Agaki. Indeed, Joe was now injured and chained up at home by Nanbu to prevent him from sneaking out to train randomly. The match between the top 4 and Mikio could only be described as unfair. Mikio could read all of his opponent's movements and both blocked and counterattacked without any openings. But Sashio revealed that Mikio had an AI gear that could read all of his opponent's movements, so basically it was unfair equipment. But when Nanbu watched, he saw that this guy didn't just rely on equipment to get there. Suddenly, Mikio made another announcement. Nanbu then ran back in an excited mood to tell Joe that luck had come to them again, that Mikio had issued a challenge to Joe to see who would be the one to enter the top 4 characters who would fight in the official tournament. No matter how they try to trap them, once on the ring, he will still have a chance. Although the other guy's gear is quite strong, Joe gets stronger as he fights, so he still has a chance. Hearing this, Joe wanted to go train, but Nanbu didn't allow it because he thought he couldn't walk completely yet. Sashio touched him lightly and it hurt, and when he took off his shirt, his body was full of bruises. Nanbu thought he should still rest, because if these bruises were shown on the ring, the opponent would aim at them to attack. Resting is also a way to train. He will be stronger when in perfect condition, and the chance to advance will also be higher. Joe was even more determined when he saw Yuri at the match that day. The characters in the company now asked Yuki if she was sure about organizing the match between Mikio and Joe. But Mikio himself had announced it to the public, so now it couldn't be withdrawn. Besides, even though Mikio is a company person, he's now also a fighter, so he has his own freedom. When leaving the meeting, Yuki was informed by her assistant that Mikio's gear also somewhat matched Yuri's. If this situation continues, Mikio will only cause more disadvantages for her. It seems she has no choice but to ask that person to help her defeat Mikio. Nanbu now met that journalist again, and was informed that the main company didn't want Mikio to participate in the tournament. Nanbu should see and find out the reason for himself. Yuki now noticed that Yuri was perfecting himself with that gear day by day. She then also saw her brother Mikio creating a gear to prepare for the upcoming match. He knew Yuki had tried to arrange a match with the top 4 for him to bring him down. She knew he was the biggest obstacle, and if he became champion, her chairman position would soon be shaken. Even though her grandfather had chosen her, in the end, it was the board of directors who had the power. Meanwhile, Joe continued to train under the bridge. Nanbu explained that each gear has a weakness in the delay when striking, but Mikio's gear is a machine controlling a person rather than a person controlling a machine, so there's almost no delay. If he's not careful, he'll end up like that top 4 guy. But Joe wanted him to talk less and just train him. He threw a powerful punch that knocked Nanbu down. The reason was that recently, he had been training physically with the kids. He believed with a punch like this, the enemy would be surprised. Nanbu wanted Sashio to speak up if he had any ideas in the future, rather than silently taking Joe to train without asking his opinion. Nanbu decided to teach Joe some combination moves so he could take advantage of the finishing move he just acquired. He would teach him every move he could think of. They both decided to train until one of them collapsed. On the day of the match, Sashio's friends found a way to sneak into the arena. Joe's group was about to enter the ring when they encountered Mikio. He had been waiting for them there and informed them that they wouldn't be able to enter the ring anymore because he had discovered the truth about Joe, that he was an outlaw and had a reputation for match fixing in underground arenas. If Joe went up now, he would reveal everything. Joe was about to rush at him, but Nanbu punched him and pulled him back. He knew from the start that this match had a predetermined outcome. As Joe hadn't appeared on the ring, the countdown had begun. Mikio swore he would take back everything Yuki had stolen from him. And so the clock hit 0 and Joe still hadn't entered the ring. Nanbu felt their journey seemed to end here. Upon returning, Joe was very angry, while Nanbu went to meet Fujimaki to face the consequences. But Nanbu hadn't completely given up. He didn't know how Mikio got information about them, and if he wanted to bring Joe down, he could have just announced the information to the public. Yet he came to meet them alone to force them to give up. Tomorrow night would be their last chance to return, and Nanbu had asked Fujimaki for help to get back into the ring. So Fujimaki informed them that 2 weeks ago, someone appeared in the underground world inquiring about Joe, but Fujimaki and his people had hidden everything. The reason Mikio had the information was due to some people who were bitter about their match fixing, so basically Mikio had no evidence to accuse Joe. Fujimaki had given him the information he needed, as this was also the last chance given to him. Fujimaki also had an important lead for him, specifically that in the underground world there was a former gear production employee for Yuki's company. That person was a regular customer here, so with a little persuasion, they could get information. That person was promptly brought to meet Fujimaki, and the process of extracting information from him began, about everything related to that technology corporation. Meanwhile, Mikio had gone to meet Yuri and claimed that he would definitely enter the main tournament and defeat Yuri, after completely bringing down Joe. But Yuri had faith in Joe, so he told Mikio to be careful because it wasn't over yet. Meanwhile, the former employee had revealed that the corporation wasn't united, but had internal conflicts, because the projects Mikio worked on were personally supervised by him instead of being handed over to the company's internal team. Sashio had overheard and told Joe. Joe suspected there must be a reason why Mikio didn't want to fight him. The former employee had told Nanbu they couldn't defeat Mikio because he had a gear that could see the opponent's movements and provide methods to block attacks. But it could only detect movements from the opponent's gear, and Joe didn't use gear, so Mikio wasn't confident when fighting him. Sashio had relayed everything he heard to Joe and helped give Joe more hope. Nanbu then decided to find someone who could help him get Joe back into the match, and that person was Yuki. He wanted a rematch between Joe and Mikio because he was sure Joe was Mikio's weakness. But she refused and said Joe was just someone who had run away from the ring. But he argued that Mikio had trapped him and Joe, and it was she who had pulled Joe into this match. But she refused to believe him because if he thought Mikio had trapped him and Joe, why should she believe him? And she didn't want to put hope in someone without gear. During that time, Joe was quite worried because when they met, Mikio showed no nervousness and remained very confident about his ability to defeat Joe. Meanwhile, Nanbu had no choice but to reveal the true evidence of his own dirty past to Yuki. She could choose to believe him or not, but the fact was that Joe had defeated strong opponents to get here, and he was a true professional. However, she still bluntly locked Nanbu in the room and left. That night, Joe suddenly encountered someone while training, and Yuki had already organized the announcement of the fourth person to enter the official tournament. Nanbu had called Sashio to report that he had failed, but Sashio informed him that Joe had disappeared. He was now riding his motorcycle to that ceremony. Yuki had just announced that the fourth person to enter the official tournament was Mikio. Just as he received the document, Joe drove his motorcycle in to intervene. Sashio let Nanbu listen, and Joe now demanded a rematch with Mikio. He refused and wanted security to take Joe away, but Yuki decided to trust Joe. She wanted Mikio to fight Joe again because Mikio had to prove himself worthy through a match, not just through a fight where the opponent didn't show up. Joe got a second chance and received half the ticket from Yuki. Not long after, the match between the two officially took place. The stadium that day was packed, and there were many viewers watching through screens. Although it was said that Joe was Mikio's counter, Joe was still at a disadvantage on the field because Mikio also had martial arts skills and didn't rely entirely on the gear. Joe was forced into a defensive position and couldn't show much. He was knocked down, and Nanbu realized that he was gradually being read even though he wasn't using the gear. Yuki knew this was a new model that Mikio developed to fight Yuri, but now had to use it against Joe. Joe tried to use new moves he had learned to respond, but Mikio's AI learned too quickly and knocked Joe down again. Joe angrily rushed in but was swept off his feet. The round ended, so Joe temporarily had time to think of a strategy. Yuki saw that the result was clear, but Yuri didn't. Joe still hadn't found a good way to face Mikio. The more he fought, the more his moves would be read. But Yuki, looking at Mikio's back, knew that Mikio wouldn't last long because he was synchronizing his brain with artificial intelligence. The longer it went on, the greater the impact on his brain. But Mikio was determined to win to see who was worthy of inheriting this company. Throughout the training process, Mikio had to inject himself with drugs countless times to maintain a stable synchronization level. Even in the third round, Joe still hadn't improved the situation much. He was still cornered against the ropes and constantly taking hits. He still taunted Mikio, only to be punched out of the ring. Nanbu didn't let Sashio touch Joe, or he would be disqualified. He wanted Joe to throw that fatal punch because he believed he could still win. Joe returned to the ring to prove that gear doesn't make a fighter. Earlier, Yuri had come to see Mikio while he was training. Mikio had asked why Yuri didn't choose AI technology like his, but instead chose that disgusting gear. If Yuri had chosen to trust Yuki, why not decide the winner and loser right here to see which gear was better? But Yuri only fights the winner. He then turned back and threw a punch, which Mikio blocked, but Yuri wanted to know if it was Mikio or the AI that blocked it. Indeed, Mikio was nothing without AI. Joe was repeatedly hit, but he rushed in to grapple Mikio and was thrown down. Both were counted as fouls, so whoever committed another would be disqualified. Joe then decided to drop his guard and let Mikio attack, but he suddenly pulled back his finishing blow instead of ending it. The round ended again, and Yuri informed us that the AI wanted to strike, but Mikio resisted. Originally, Joe dropped his guard so Mikio wouldn't know what he was planning. In fact, he had almost gambled on that opportunity just now. Now Joe had what he wanted, a chance to throw one punch and end the match. Mikio was now hesitating whether to turn off the automatic system or not. The support team advised him to turn it off, but he refused. And then when the round began, Joe still didn't take a defensive stance but stood still. Mikio launched an attack at Joe's face, but not enough to finish him off. Joe had asked Nanbu to help him observe, and then both of them simultaneously realized Mikio was about to rush in for a finishing blow. Nanbu knew it was a straight left punch, and as Mikio charged forward, he extended his right hand, but then struck with his left. Joe had anticipated this and dodged slightly, then landed a straight hook to Mikio's jaw. He was the one who fell, while Joe remained standing. With that, everyone shouted loudly as someone from the bottom of the rankings had risen to become one of the 4 people who would participate in the official tournament. Mikio then turned away and officially acknowledged Joe as a formidable opponent, a true fighter. Although Mikio's actions were somewhat negative, no one could deny that he was trying his best to assert his value, aiming to rise and regain his position in this company. Joe then exchanged a few greetings with Yuri, now having reached his tournament and ready to fight again. Yuri had to acknowledge Joe but still saw him as just a stray dog, though not an ordinary one. That night, Nanbu and the group organized a party to celebrate Joe's victory. Nanbu was drinking with his friends, while Joe just wanted to go rest. But then Nanbu suddenly went outside to meet Fuji. He came because he had unfinished business with Nanbu. Nanbu still hadn't told Joe and Sashio what had really happened, but Fuji said the game was over, and now he would have to explain to Joe. Actually, 3 months ago, Fuji had demanded that he bring Joe to the main tournament, but they wouldn't be allowed to win. The reason was that Fuji wanted to arrange a large-scale fixed match, and Nanbu had agreed to this with Fuji. Nanbu now tried to persuade Joe to follow his match-fixing plan. Joe thought he didn't trust him, but he knew the boy was very talented. It's just that people like them, no matter how hard they try, can't match those in power. He really wanted to let him participate in the tournament cleanly, but they had to use fake IDs to participate, so now there was no turning back. Joe felt he had lost all trust in Nanbu and decided to turn away. Sashio also couldn't believe what Nanbu had done, so he turned away. Fuji reminded Nanbu that if he didn't fulfill the agreement, the price would be paid not just by him, but by the other 2 as well. The next morning, the 4 contestants participating in the main tournament had a press conference, but Joe didn't attend. He was now at the house of the old mechanic uncle. The old man couldn't believe that just 3 months ago, he was still a nobody, and now he's someone known by many. Meanwhile, Nanbu had gone to find Sashio. The little boy thought he had taken advantage of Joe, but he knew the boy was no different from him. He knew Sashio's father was once an engineer at that company through the story of that former employee. He learned that Sashio's father had his research project stolen by the company and was silenced. The little boy had to admit and revealed that his mother also passed away a year later due to illness, which is why he became like this now. He then took Sashio along. They both went to a party where Yuki was present. He revealed that he and Sashio both had the same goal of revenge against this company, and they only accidentally ended up on the same boat thanks to Joe. Now that Joe had left, he could only help Sashio get revenge by giving the boy a knife and letting him go in and take revenge if he wanted. The little boy had that idea in mind, but suddenly saw children inside and reconsidered. They both bet their revenge on Joe by helping him reach the top. They chose to believe in Joe, so now Joe is their hope. But now if Joe doesn't fix the match, Fuji will be the force they need to worry about, because Fuji has enough power to confront Yuki's entire tech conglomerate. Nanbu then went in to meet Yuki and asked her to take care of Sashio, because after all, her company also owed the little boy. He wouldn't ask too much from her, just that she take care of Sashio until Joe's match is over. This would be the last time he met her directly, and he also handed over the evidence for Sashio to keep. A few days later, the first match of the official tournament took place. Yuki had also conducted an internal investigation of the company and found out that indeed, Sashio's father's research project had been illegally seized by her company. In this first match, the first fighter to enter the ring was a Mexican fighter. He was the second-ranked fighter known by the nickname The Spider, Pepe. His opponent was the champion of the company that organized this tournament, with the nickname King of Kings, Yuri. Yuki had now sent her assistant to find the illegal transaction elements in the company and purge those components. Joe had also come to watch Yuri's match while Nanbu was at a place drinking. At the start, Pepe with his fighting style and long reach was continuously attacking, but Yuri remained calm and carefully observed his opponent's actions to respond. Both sides exchanged blows and quickly ended round 1. In round 2, Pepe again took the initiative and rushed at Yuri, forcing him to dodge dangerous blows and step back. Just as Pepe was boasting that he would defeat Yuri, he immediately lunged forward and landed a hook to Pepe's chin, followed by another blow to knock Pepe down completely. No one could see Yuri's move until they watched it on the slow-motion screen. When leaving, Joe met Yuri outside the arena. Joe liked the move Yuri had thrown. Yuri asked Joe why he didn't use gear. Initially, he didn't use it to stand out, but now he liked the thrill of not using gear. He wanted to fight a match with Yuri, one that would help him truly grow whether he won or lost. He asked what Yuri's purpose for fighting was. He fought because he owed Yuki. She was the one who brought him this far. Meanwhile, Nanbu was drunkenly heading to Joe's training place. He had just had a small conversation with Fuji. He said Nanbu was like a scorpion. Stinging other creatures had become ingrained in the scorpion's nature. Even if they were riding on a frog's back to cross a river, instinct would make it sting the frog and then both would drown. So Fuji's point here was that if Nanbu only knew how to follow his instincts, he would soon drag Joe to death with him. In the following days, the press continuously reported on Joe's upcoming match. Everyone was betting high odds on Joe. Fuji had called to inform that Nanbu's initial plan seemed to be going very smoothly. Now he just needed to ensure that Joe would throw the match. Nanbu then set off to leave and Fuji's men also followed to make sure. Meanwhile, Yuki noticed that Sashio was still helping her with some housework. The little boy just didn't want to be known as a freeloader in her house without doing anything. She asked Sashio if he wanted to come watch Joe's match, but the boy refused and turned away. And that night, the match between Joe and his opponent took place. Joe's opponent was a fighter known as the Deadly Lion, Glenn. In this match, Joe would be like Wu Song, although not fighting a tiger barehanded, but fighting a lion barehanded. He was considered to be someone who continuously created miracles without needing supportive technology. Sashio was a bit scared at this time, and remembered how Joe had taught him how to overcome that fear by touching something, which would help bring him back to reality. Joe was still thinking about whether to follow Nanbu's instructions or not. Nanbu was now sitting with Fuji. Fuji and the bookmakers all wanted Nanbu to let Joe fight well in the first 2 rounds and throw the match in the last minute of round 3. Fuji had invited Nanbu for a meal to see if he considered this the last meal of his life. Glenn on the other side had made a flashy entrance by riding on a golden monster truck, while Joe now seemed to have changed himself. He was wearing his own gear, the shabby gear he had thrown aside for the past few months. Everyone was surprised and thought this was Joe's strategy because today Joe had no one to support him. Joe then heard Nanbu's words. He said the match fixing would be in round 3, so he should hang on until then. Sashio had now arrived at the arena and met his friends again, but the little boy chose not to go in and ran away. On the ring, Joe still hasn't shown himself to be at a significant disadvantage, even though Nanbu is constantly giving him instructions from above. He completely ignores the old man's advice and fights in his own way. Indeed, he has been able to trouble Glenn by consistently trading blows and nearly landing a hook on Glenn's chin. When Glenn counterattacks, Joe manages to block with his hands and survives the first round. At Nanbu's position, Fuji's bodyguards advise him not to try to help Joe win, but he believes Joe had a chance to win and deliberately missed it. Fuji also acknowledges that Joe had an opportunity to win, but intentionally passed it up to avoid being recognized as fixing the match. However, it's clear that Joe is not listening to Nanbu's assistance at all. Moving into the second round, Joe maintains his stubborn nature and refuses to listen to Nanbu's words, as the old man is only trying to help him last until the third round rather than helping him win. But soon after, Joe begins to struggle against Glenn, forcing him to listen to Nanbu's advice to stay in the game. The second round ends this way. Sashio is now angry at both Nanbu and Joe because they're both only following their own desires, but the boy realizes he's no different in using Joe for revenge. The boy then notices the ring and starts to listen to Joe about trying some exercise. He practices a few punches. The third round begins, and Nanbu wants Joe to give up, promising him freedom if he gets through this. However, Fuji has no intention of letting either of them go free after this, as Joe will always be a money-making machine for him. Joe is pushed to the corner of the ring, and Sashio runs in at this moment. The boy tells Joe to pull himself together and fight for himself. Yuri suddenly leaves the spectator area. The bookmaker's people have to send security to catch Sashio, but Joe is knocked down by Glenn's punch. Yuri has come down to wake Joe up because of the promise he made to him, and Nanbu is the one who gives him the last bit of motivation. He wants Joe to stand up and fight the way he's fighting the bookmakers up here. He admits that Joe truly has talent and that it's not just boasting. Joe then stands up and returns to the fight. He uses his smaller body to dodge Glenn's attacks and then lands a hit on him. He continues to exploit openings to hook Glenn in the face. Although that punch misses, it sets up his left punch afterward. This is the move he learned from Yuri. Sashio joyfully runs up and drops Joe's ID. Nanbu has given up at this point, and Fuji thinks his scorpion has chosen the wrong person to sting. Yuri is now truly jealous of Joe and has to admit that he's an excellent fighter. Joe then runs up to find that Nanbu has sacrificed his remaining eye for him. He is the one who wants to see Joe succeed more than anyone, and now he has sacrificed that opportunity to help Joe continue moving forward. He doesn't regret this decision. Fuji lets them both take Nanbu away. That night, Yuri comes to find Yuki and tells her about his desire to remove the gear to fight Joe fairly. He wants to overcome Joe with his own strength, not with this unbalanced tool. Yuki initially doesn't want to because she wants to use Yuri's fight to show the world how the gear industry can develop. Yuki refuses Yuri's request, but he doesn't beg her, only informs her. If she doesn't agree, he won't return here anymore. The next day, Joe is still training frantically, not just because of what happened to Nanbu, but also because he's about to fight Yuri. Nanbu returns at this time. He has brought Agaki and his trainer. Nanbu wants to ask Agaki to be Joe's sparring partner, as he's obviously better than the punching bag. They both have a chance to return to the ring. Agaki's leg has healed, so they can fight freely now. Joe also regrets not being able to finish off Agaki that day, but the trainer reminds them both that this is just sparring. Nanbu is very happy because just 3 months ago, they were fixing matches in the underground world, and now they're fighting for the world championship. But the price to pay is not small. However, Nanbu thinks he has seen enough. Meanwhile, Yuri has come to Mikio's house in the forest. His purpose is to ask Mikio for help with one thing, to help him remove the gear so he can fight Joe. Mikio is not sure this will be successful because the gear has become a part of Yuri's body, and he only has relatively primitive tools. Meanwhile, Yuki has been constantly remembering Yuri. Suddenly, someone calls her. She goes and meets Yuri, who has undergone surgery to remove the gear. Mikio, though he has left the family, thinks he should let Yuki know about this. Yuri has advertised well for the gear that she desired throughout many fights, so now at least let Yuri do what he wants. But Yuki still wants to cancel the final match. She then returns to the company and learns a lot of true information about Joe, that he's just a person without identity. So just by releasing this evidence, she could cancel the final match. But would doing so be right, and would she ruin Yuri's life because of this? She needs time to think, so she will temporarily keep this evidence. Nanbu now remembers when he first met Joe and saw potential in him, so he recruited him for training and money-making. He then listens and realizes Joe is forgetting his teaching about distributing force evenly. He's blind, not deaf, so Joe can't fool him. After the training session, Agaki has to admit that Joe is very talented and capable of defeating Yuri. Nanbu realizes that maybe Joe has been the one taking care of him all this time. Yuri is now being torn apart by pain. He constantly bangs on the door, forcing Mikio to lock him up. Mikio lets Yuki know that Yuri has been like this for 5 days, and they can't do anything but pray for Yuri to overcome himself. Mikio actually still has a way to help Yuri reduce the pain, but Yuri has refused and wants to overcome it himself. He believes if it were Yuki, she could persuade Yuri to use medicine to temporarily relieve the pain and rest. She went in to see Yuri and wanted to take him back, but he said his master taught him that he should keep an eye on the person he's willing to fight for life. Now that he has found that person, he doesn't want Yuki to take away his reason for living. The next morning, Yuki comes back to check on Yuri. He has overcome the pain and is training again. She realizes Yuri's figure is very similar to when she first met him on the training ground. Yuki then decides to leave and end things with Yuri so he can do what he wants. She then goes to find Joe to return this fake ID card to him. She really knew who he was but ignored it. She also reveals that Yuri has removed the gear to be able to fight him. Although Joe is shocked, he is also very excited that his opponent has shown such determination. Therefore, he also tries to train persistently without stopping to respond to Yuri in the best condition. And then not long after, the day of the decisive fight finally arrives. On the day before the fight, Joe was given a lucky charm ticket by Nanbu that Agaki had given him before. And on the day of the match, everyone is surprised to see 2 fighters not using gear on the field. At the same time, Sashio notices scars on the parts of Yuri's body where gear used to be attached. Indeed, Yuri is the perfect opponent for Joe. Yuki is still angry with Yuri and doesn't come to watch the final match. Joe is now gradually being overwhelmed by Yuri on the field. Losing the gear doesn't slow Yuri down, but gives him the best condition ever. All of Joe's moves are seen through by Yuri. After some fighting, the first round ends. Joe has to admit that he's being dominated by Yuri, so now he needs to get serious. Nanbu says that although Yuri is good at both defense and offense, he's still human, so sooner or later there will be an opening. During the break, Yuri doesn't sit down to rest. Everyone thinks he's energetic, but Mikio knows Yuri is currently suppressing the pain after surgery. If he sits down now, he won't be able to stand up again. Back to round 2, Joe continues to defend, but in a moment he rises up and throws a hook forcing Yuri to dodge. As Yuri prepares to counter, Joe ducks through and strikes back. Noticing Yuri is about to counter again, he immediately returns to a defensive stance. He then finds another opportunity to attack, but is immediately dodged by Yuri, who lands a direct punch. Joe then continues to stand up, but the round is also over. Nanbu knows this will be an endurance match. Whoever makes a mistake or gets exhausted first will be the loser. In the subsequent rounds, Joe continuously defends, waiting for Yuri to make a mistake. However, Yuri is very alert, intentionally exposing openings to lure Joe into attacking so he can counter. Joe has to watch Yuri's foot positioning to find openings, but Yuri's chance of making a mistake is extremely low. Yuri throws another punch to lure Joe to dodge, and then he lands a hit on Joe's side. But just as he's about to hook, Joe dodges and counterattacks. Neither shows signs of fatigue or giving the other an advantage. Meanwhile, Yuki has gone to meet with the military to introduce her product. However, they want her to integrate weapons into the gear. She refuses because she only creates tools to help, not weapons. But they argue that she has turned it into a weapon by letting fighters use it in the tournament. The grueling match between Yuri and Joe has now reached the 7th round. Sashio sees Yuri fighting alone without support, so he brings him a glass of water. They all respect an opponent like him and don't want him to lose just because of lack of water. He accepts it and continues the fight. The two extend the fight to the 10th round, but the intensity hasn't decreased at all. By the end of the 11th round, Joe has started to show clear signs of fatigue. But Nanbu reminds him who he is the strongest fighter in the tournament, and even though Yuri is the champion, he's still nothing. Joe then regains his spirit to continue defending against Yuri's stormy attacks. By the start of the 13th round, Joe decides to stop defending. He continuously trades blows with Yuri. The ring is now hotter than ever, and Yuri feels truly lucky to have met Joe. He then decides to end the fight with Joe in a single blow. Both rush in and throw their strongest punch at each other. After hearing the result of the fight, Yuki rushes back, and we see an image of one of the two fighters being hospitalized. Not long after, Nanbu decides to reopen the gym. Yuri is watching TV and is invited by Sashio to tonight's party. A few days ago, Yuki came to congratulate but left quite quickly. Yuri feels that a whole year has passed. Joe is now learning car repair from the uncle and working as a delivery man. Yuki is planning to reopen the tournament once more, and the mechanic uncle asks Joe if he intends to return as a fighter. He's not sure if he should return, but currently, he feels it's enough for him. On the way, Joe stops to look at the sea and starts to dance a few boxing moves again. And with this, the film ends.